Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Jackson Bliss in support of counterfactual love stories and other experiments and in conversation this evening with author Julie Buntin. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed this evening, but you can keep the chat window open. So I will be sharing links to purchase counterfactual love songs and other counterfactual love stories, and other experiments from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature to submit any questions you might have for Jackson this evening at any time. I will read a selection of those questions on your behalf at the conclusion of the conversation. Live transcription is available to you as well using the CC icon that is available to you at the bottom of your screen. Of course, if you are watching us later on YouTube, links to purchase books are in the description below. And you can also subscribe to our events, to our channel rather, to be kept up to date on our events as they become available on our channel. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, of course, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd just like to thank you for joining us this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be doing so. Without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Jackson Bliss is a nonfiction writer, librettist, screenwriter, and composer. He's a mixed-race APA author of Amnesia, of June Bugs, Dream Pop Origami, and the speculative fiction hypertext Dukkha My Love. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Tin House, Plowshares, Guernica, Boston Review, Long Reads, Kenyon Review, among others. He lives in Los Angeles with his wife and their two dogs. Joining him in conversation, Julie Buntin is from Northern Michigan. Her debut novel, Marlena, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize, translated into 10 languages and named the best book of the year by over a dozen outlets, including the Washington Post, NPR, and Kirkus. Her writing has appeared in the Atlantic, Vogue, and the New York Times Book Review, Guernica, and elsewhere. Her novel, In Progress, is the winner of the 2019 Ellen Levine Fund for Writers Award. She teaches creative writing at the University of Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Jackson Bliss and Julie Buntin into your living rooms.
Yay. Jackson, I'm so happy to be talking to you tonight about this incredible book. I'm so sad it's not happening in person at Literati, which
Me too.
is what should be, considering how we met in Ann Arbor. I feel like this conversation is sort of like destined to happen about your work, and here it is happening virtually. I'm glad we're able to do it, but it would be better if it was live. But let's get things started, if this makes sense for you, with a little bit of a sample of the prose, if you want to read for us.
Sure. So just to give a quick context to everyone here, this book is sort of comprised of two basic themes. The first is the negotiation of mixed race identity in Michigan and the American Midwest. And the second sort of ongoing theme is counterfactual love. So that is like love in an alternate world, love inside our mind, love in daydreams, love in our sleep, et cetera, et cetera. So those are like the two major themes that sort of interconnect. And I'm going to read just an excerpt of a larger short story in here. It's about a mixed race art critic who lives in Ann Arbor, appropriately enough. And basically it's told backwards, and it starts when she's blind and the story begins when she's told the diagnosis by her doctor. So I'm just going to read like, 4 or 5 little pages, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so this is Blue is the Loneliest Number. Number 5, glowing open book. It was after her world disintegrated, into semi-pixelated darkness that she learned to identify the difference between a sigh of pathos, a sigh of unexpected pleasure, and a sigh of insecurity masquerading as ennui in people. Blindness had become a monastery of synesthesia. Human skin was a half-open glowing book. At certain moments, she discovered that skin was a genius of sensation, recognizing the smallest nuance in pressure, warmth, or movement. In this temple of intangibility where her material ego was slowly plucked like millipede legs, Yumi let go of her attachment to Rinaldi's beauty, which was hard. Dude was fucking hot. The problem with making love had always been that it had to end at some point. It began with foreplay, circling fingertips, grazing erogenous hairpin curves, smooth palms gliding down thighs, sweet and smooth like rice paper candy. It continued with their Mesozoic engineering, inciting mobs of blood cells to sprint through leg capillaries as they swelled, her longing tidal wave through her bones as a hot and burning sensation rioted through her skin, the circumference of her pleasure expanding past the suburbs of functionality, the pleasure so throbbing and so expansive she couldn't contain it anymore. When they made love now, her pleasure wasn't functional. It wasn't in the service of some mythical idea. It wasn't stumbled upon pleasure. It was rebellious pleasure, the pleasure of the sodomitical mother, the revolution against functionality, where bodies expressed affection for each other using fingers, lips, and tongues as interpreters of unvocalized desire. 6, the triumphant bugle. Okay, put your hands here, he said. Now what? She asked. Now pick the pencil. She scowled. Rinaldi, you're trying to trick me. You've got 3 big mechanical pencils and 1 gel roller, and this is a Sharpie. So there's 3 pencils. Bene, that was a gift. Make it harder. Okay, which is grapefruit and which is orange? Yumi touched each fruit with her hands and inhaled. This is the grapefruit. No, wait. This is. You can tell by the smell. If you say so. Am I right or not? Sì, olfatto. Sì. Cool. Now, can we go underneath the sink? I can never tell the difference between fabric softener and detergent. 7, trumpet playing angels. Yumi moved her hands across the walls of her craftsman house in Carytown, noticing the bumpy texture in the paint. There were thousands of fragmented braille plot twist histories and myths all pressed into the hard surface of her drywall, like a secret library hiding within the walls. She used to love these walls back when she could distinguish between avocado and shamrock green, but the slow deterioration of her vision, what she once ignorantly referred to as the death sentence of material color, also meant a loss of kitsch, especially during her daily walks to the Old West Side and back. To her, this meant the erasure of 1, bubblegum pink button-downs and young alcoholics detoxing on green coconuts. 2, Nike swooshes brandish on insecure men. 3, overplucked black eyebrow worms. 4, Midwestern women with brassy blonde dye jobs driving in SUVs. 5, Tony the Tiger Prince in orange gowns and dirty U of M baseball caps. 6, obese Trump supporters driving black Hummers down Liberty with NRA and fuck your feelings bumper stickers. 7, violin players busking in the corner like desolate angels. 8, dancers, or were they priests? As her world faded from her collective mind, her fingers were discovering an ancient language of texture for the first time. Even 6 months ago, this was impossible. Reading used to be the prerogative of her eyes. She only used her fingers to turn pages, accepting their humble role as servants of her visual field, as common messengers of language. But then one day, her soft fingers were expected to flesh out a coherent narrative, from a battlefield of paint smudges and goosebumps. Her untrained fingers didn't know how to sniff out secret objects or material romance. They weren't drug dogs, for God's sakes. Now, texture was just an alphabet. Bumps were a foreign language, and reading had become an abacus of lost words slowly adding up, a lexicon inside her head. Yumi's fingertips glided over the smooth, nippy window panes, past the closed, kawaii piano that no longer sang the notes of Gershwin or Rachmaninoff, until she came to the tape deck in her fancy stereo console. She wanted to tape herself, so later on, she could listen to her own voice and hear the inflection of the viewer, to remember what it felt like to turn each day into a graphic novella of nothingness, or protest her life simply by sleeping in.
Thank you so much, Jackson. That was such a great way to start this conversation. I love that story. I think where I'd like to start is just to hear a little bit about how this collection came to be. I will admit that I saw an interview with you where you mentioned that you started at least one of these stories, I think Scylla's Asterisk, in 2002, if that's right. So these stories have been like a long time in progress, and there's a reference to Animal Crossing in here. So I know, I assume you've been tinkering with them up until very recently. So I'm curious to hear sort of about the evolution of the book and how it came to be the book that we're celebrating tonight.
Yeah. My first story, I mean, I basically wrote in my very first workshop as like, an adult. I was like in my, I don't know, late 20s, and I just couldn't give up the need to write. So I took my first workshop in Portland, Oregon, and I just remember, no one told me what you could and couldn't do. So I was like, cool. So I wrote like a 45-page short story and just plopped it in everyone's desk, And I didn't know, like, that's just totally not cool to like drop that huge of manuscript, in people's laps. And the other thing was they just looked at me like, you think this is a story? Because basically those of you that read it or will read it, this story is about this mixed race character who gets to this intersection in Chicago, and she basically has 8 different destinies. On the 4 different streets, she walks down with and without her overdue library books. And I thought it was like a cool concept. And of course, at the time I was like vibing a lot of my favorite movies. So there was a movie called Run Lola Run that uses similar thematics. And then Amélie came out, and then City of God came out as well, that amazing Brazilian movie. And they all sort of play with like plot structure, and they sort of like complicate linearity in a really intentional, sort of satisfyingly non-linear way that I just love, and they're all really character-based and like really engrossing ways. So those texts actually were the things that inspired me to write this piece. And it would take me about probably 12 years to whittle that thing down, you know what I mean, to the 36 pages it is now. So yeah, I mean, that was the first piece. I think that when I wrote it, I realized I was a writer and that I had an interesting way to tell stories, and that I shouldn't, compromise. But then I went to workshop and I felt awful. And then I felt like I should have totally compromised everything, just for their sake. So
that's just how workshop goes more often than not, sadly.
Mhm.
I mean, it's interesting because, for a story, so there's that story which you started and had this, it seems like clearly it had to be here as the story that made you figure out something about who you are as a writer. And then the thing that's interesting about your book, and one thing that was really exciting reading it, is that it feels like a collection of stories, very much so, but it also feels like it has this sort of like compiling intelligence, this like narrator, like putting the book together, the presence of the author, and these sort of like interstitial playful experiments, I guess, for lack of a better word, like multiple choice tests or things of that nature, just to fill in people who haven't read it yet. And I guess I'm curious about how like the process that goes into taking a story like Scylla's Asterisk or something that is like this discrete sort of standalone piece, and then putting a book like this together where like so much of the pleasure is about the connections between stories that you couldn't have known like would be connected when you wrote them, I guess. So like I'm wondering what it felt like to kind of piece that together, and maybe when you did that work.
Yeah. So I think it started when I started submitting this manuscript to book contests, you know what I mean? Because they'll often ask you like, please give us a 2 paragraph summary. And I realized like, I don't fucking know what this book's about, you know what I mean? Like at all, like I have stories.
Yeah.
And I think I was naive. When I first started writing stories, I simply thought, you just write a bunch of stories, you put it together, you'll figure your shit out, you know what I mean? And then I started realizing that as I was studying short story collections that had been published, right? Either through agents or through, short story collection contests, I realized, oh yeah, there's a really strong like thematic here connecting things. There's a really strong current here. And so I think in the past 3 or 4 years, they started looking at all the manuscripts in terms of how they spoke into a larger like conversation, you know what I mean? Like the sort of macro structure that they shared and the issues they might overlap with. And I think first off, I had to realize what was actually in this collection and what wasn't. And I had a couple pieces that like I loved, you know what I mean, that just didn't fit. And I had to sort of like, I had to punt those pieces, and let, they're sort of like cryogenically frozen in my hard drive, like waiting to be like resurrected. And I had to decide then what was the trajectory, like what was the first story, what was the last, like, did I want to put a huge story after another huge story, those kind of things. And I think what really helped me too was Wayne State University Press has this really amazing series called the Made in Michigan series. And I loved the books. I read it so much. And actually, I bought several of them in Literati. And I remember just thinking, this is great. I love this so much. And then I went home and I was like, could I reconceptualize this collection, you know what I mean, as mostly Midwestern and mostly Michigan. And I realized it was so easy for me to do that because like you, I spent, a good chunk of my life before I left the Midwest in the Midwest. So it was an easy thing for me to sort of dip into. And it helped me honestly sort of glue everything together in a really beautiful way. Because now I knew what was connecting them sort of culturally, and geographically. And then I could go back and make all the little changes that make the piece feel connected now instead of just thrown in.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that makes sense to me that the unifying principle or like the organizational principle of the book would have to come from like a thematic place in addition to like a structural place in order for it to feel as satisfying as it does. For people, I don't think this is a spoiler, but there's this like amazing, at first, this gives me like such a thrill as a reader in the story Kothar Shinka. Am I saying that right, Jackson? Am I pronouncing the title right? Yeah. Where there's an artist at the center of the story who's a glass blower, and some of the things he creates you find in the text as you read the text outside of that story. So it's like this sort of like magical feeling of participating in some kind of creative process along with this character. But I do want to loop back to your comments about the Midwest, because I think another thing that's really interesting and specific about this book is that so often, and I feel like you'll relate to this, I feel as someone born and raised in Michigan, that when I read about the Midwest, it's like a little bit almost like exoticized as like let me tell you about the Midwest, you people who don't know about the Midwest. But your book is written, it's of this place and written like to this place with a real sense that your reader doesn't need to be, you don't need to explain like where these places are. And I guess I'm curious about how you do you think of yourself as sort of a Michigan writer? Like, what does that mean to you? And how did you think about exploring this place and your sort of responsibility to it as someone who has lived here and also hasn't lived here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm conflicted because like I always think of myself simultaneously as a Michigan writer and as a California writer, as a Midwestern writer and as a West Coast writer, just because I spent basically, the past 30 years of my life between the Midwest and the West Coast, but especially California. Yeah. So I do think this is a sort of ongoing negotiation on my part. But I think that when I was living in Ann Arbor and I was sort of really invested in trying to construct a Michigan narrative that felt true to me. Part of it was I wanted to write stories that I wish I had read as like, a mixed race teenager growing up in Michigan, because I just wish that I could have read about what it's like to for example, have a grandparent born in Asia, you know what I mean? And to have your identity not be something that people understand by looking at you, and, just understanding the sort of like the othered space, in Michigan that is quite common for people to live here. And I think on the other hand, like part of me really wanted to also write a story that didn't have a sort of like, I don't know, sort of stereotypical great outdoors Michigan narrative, which I feel like I see a lot, like here's a moose, you know what I mean? And here are hunters, and you know what I mean? Like here's 3 people on snowmobiles who are going to find a sense of inner peace by going to, the middle of the Upper Peninsula and finding themselves, or I don't know. Like I just see that shit. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I didn't want to cut you off, but I just feel just enthusiastically, I think that's like why one reason this book is really important, right? It's like there's so many stories of like white Michiganders, rural space. I wrote one like these rural spaces, and that's what we think of. But Michigan is also full of like endless strip malls and many cities, and has diverse populations, and and it feels like you're really taking that on in a kind of in a way that hasn't been taken on before.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to, you know what I mean? With the understanding that like your book is absolutely probably the best book that's based in Michigan that I've ever read. But that said, Julie Buntin, I was trying to say, could we expand, the literary archive a little bit and imagine the story told in ways that we haven't seen, both in terms of the racial identity of the characters, but also the specific forms in which the short stories are told.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. I love that mission. So I have a question for you about what it means to be like, so the title of the book is Counterfactual Love Stories and Other Experiments. And this book could be talked about, I think, as experimental fiction. Maybe that's its BISAC code. I don't know. Like it's probably been talked about in that way or reviewed in that way. And I guess I'm curious about what that means to you, if you like what it means for something to be considered experimental fiction, or what you meant by experiments, and where that sense of experimentation is coming through in the book. And I have my own theories about it, but I'm curious about where you're coming from in those traces. And then also like I guess the other side of this question is like, how important is experimentation to you as an artist? Like that, is that necessary in the process of making fiction for you? So it's kind of a 2-pronged question.
Yeah. I mean, I think your question gets to the heart of what I wanted to do here and what I think about when I think of myself as an artist. So I do think experimentation is really like important. Here's the weird thing: most experimentalists that I know don't even include me in their club. You know what I mean? Like when we talk, they basically are like, well, you're not really an experimentalist, Jackson. I mean, you experiment with your text a little bit, but like I don't think I'm avant-garde enough. I don't think I'm hardcore enough. You know what I mean? For some of the real like hardcore experimentalists, and that's fine with me, because to be honest, I refer to it as experimental fiction just because I feel like that's probably the only generic descriptor that people would like get. But really, I think of myself as a conceptual writer. Like I don't mind using other narrative modalities, like using moments of realism or using surrealism or other sort of like subgenres of fiction to tell a story. I'm not attached to the experimental label, and since I'm not avant-garde enough for that club anyways, I just sort of feel like it's just the closest thing I could come up with, you know what I mean? But in answer to your second question, which I love, I feel like for me, experimental writing, well, conceptual writing, as I call it, is really about play, like the beauty, the importance, and the utility of being able to play with storytelling, you know what I mean? The importance of play as a reader and as a writer. And I think maybe a little psychological motivation I had for writing this way is because I just remember reading those really boring ass like social studies like essays we had to read in Michigan growing up, and I just hated them. It was just like I wanted to fucking kill myself. You know what I mean? I wanted to like smash my like forehead on the desk and just be taken away to the nearest hospital. And I felt like why wasn't reading fun? Growing up as a kid, like why didn't we make it more fun? And one of the first times I realized that reading could be fun was choose your own adventure novels.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that's why there are those interludes between this, short stories, giving readers the ability to actually choose the actual trajectory of the book, because I wanted to bring that sort of element in and remind them, as, I was sort of recollecting as well, that, when we think of reading as being not just exhilarating and helping us examine the human condition, but also a sort of way of going back into your childhood, into your imagination, which is the source of so much great shit that we write, I feel like you can, open up other avenues of storytelling and also give readers something that they didn't maybe know that they're allowed to do, which is like, I think, have fun as they read.
Yeah. That's such a great response. I feel like one of the pleasures here also is that this isn't reading as like a passive experience. It's reading that implicates you as the reader, whether you're thinking about what you would choose in a kind of choose your own adventure or multiple choice kind of like moment where the text asks you to make a decision on its behalf, which is just an interesting position to be put in as a reader and really unusual. And for me, like that is where that sense of experimentation or like discovery is kind of coming from at every turn, and then how that intersects with the stories themselves. But I guess I'm curious, like that kind of rhythm, it's almost like a kind of call and response thing that's happening between the text and the reader. Like you have a musical background, right? You are a musician and have done a lot of interdisciplinary work. Like, is there something, are you pulling from places, you've mentioned films earlier in the conversation, but other sources of art for this kind of structural thematic play? Do you have like sort of direct inspiration? Or is it a grab bag?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about the operative metaphor of like the fugue, you know what I mean? Like this repeating theme in music. So I think unconsciously it's there in everything I write, but I think consciously when I was working in this collection in particular, I was thinking a lot about how reader and writer could collapse their roles, you know what I mean? And how they could respond to each other, how maybe, what if the entire book was sort of like sheet of music? That's something that I thought about a lot. I met up with this Japanese concert pianist about 2-3 months ago in LA, and she was saying, why don't like fiction writers use musical notation for their readings? Like in other words, like why don't we have like sforzandos, you know what I mean, and like all this notation? And I was like, I actually think it's a great question, like, and I think the other part of that is our attempt as writers, creative writers, to sort of connect music and as a theme and music as a sort of narrative structure is like really limited. I mean, we don't have a lot of examples of that. It's like we can all cite, TSL string quartets, but I don't know about you, but what I thought that piece was going to be before I read it and how it actually was when I read it were like drastically different. You know what I mean? And I was disappointed at the sort of lack of musicality in, that poem. So I guess I think I always think about how could a note, a melody, or a theme come back again, and maybe not necessarily in my writing, but in the reader's response, or can they, through their witnessing, notice another theme, another motif that comes out later that makes the score richer for them, you know what I mean, as a result of being active readers as opposed to passive ones.
That's really interesting. I think it's making me also think of how you use silence in this book, or silence is maybe not always the right word, but like the pause or like a break. And sometimes that's in the form of like a list that moves on to the next thing without giving us any sort of context. And I think we kind of heard a little bit of that in what you read. Sometimes it's ending a story, like when you feel as a reader that it shouldn't be, it's like, that it's happening on purpose because you're being told that it is, but you're getting put into this position of like quiet instead of where there should be sound, sort of, or where you're expecting there to be sound. How does that work for you? Like, do you think of that as just an extension of this kind of musicality that's part of your process, or is that something that's coming in later in revision, or are you breaking things after you've written them to sort of see how it torques the narrative once you've figured it out?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the above, you know what I mean? Like, on the sentence level, I'm definitely conscious. I mean, I have a sort of formalist approach to writing, so I definitely think about the form of how I write as much as what I write. And I think that, I have a sort of like craft, like maxim that I talk about a lot in my workshops that I use for my own life, which is basically, I write for myself, but I revise for the reader. And I think the more I revise, the harsher I am, but one thing I the one area where I will give myself a little bit of, creative license is with the musicality of a line, a phrasing, the cadence of a section. And so one thing about pause is, kind of going back to what you're asking, which I actually love this question, is, in music notation, a pause is an actual notation. You know what I mean? In right? In language, it's the absence of something. You know what I mean? It's not, it doesn't have a positive presence, but in a score of music, like, when you're just there and you make no sound, it's an active process. And I wanted to find ways in this book, where readers are sort of forced to just stop for a second and go, okay, sometimes I try to use like an original metaphor to get them to stop for a second. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's just the space between the end of a story, and the interlude of a next, sometimes it's like, one of the interludes in here has 4-page numbers that don't exist. You know what I mean? So I'm like trying to basically eject the reader into space and force them to just come back and be like, okay, thanks a lot, Jackson. You know what I mean? So I did try to find different ways to create space and silence as a part of the text, as opposed to the absence of it here, for sure.
Yeah, there's I think I'm gonna forget. I think it's in one of the there's this in the footnoted Cohen's there's like the quote with no content. And it's like this, you have this experience as a reader of like wanting to fill it in, but trying to also like listen to the text to imagine what the text would want you to fill in. There's like this really interesting vibration that happens there. It's really, really cool. I think so. You've kind of danced around this a little bit, and I've been reading. I just started reading Peter Ho Davies. I know he's someone whose work you admire, and you know him a little bit. His new book about the art of revision. So you're sort of aside about how you think of revision as a process for the reader versus writing for yourself. I want to dig into that a little bit more. Also, just like knowing that you took a 46-page story and you made it what it is here in this book. So can you talk about revision a little bit more? Like what does that mean? Like the reader, thinking now about the reader's role, and I think you have kind of talked about it, but are there like concrete things that you would do during that process? Revision questions you ask yourself, is it different for different stories?
Yeah. I think my general process writing a draft is basically the way I look at people like studying a foreign language. Like when you start a foreign language, like in the beginning, just get people to talk. You know what I mean? Like if you like interrupt a speaker every time they're trying to like learn French, they'll just say, fuck this. You know what I mean? Like, I hate this language. You hurt my heart and I want to leave. Right. So in the beginning, it's like almost anything they say, you're like, oh, wonderful. And I have a similar attitude towards like the first draft. Like the first draft, I just want to get it on the page and I want to be as audacious as possible. And when I come back and revise it the next, 35 times, I start to be like more and more brutally honest, like, and I start to realize like, that's not a great metaphor. Like that analogy makes no sense. Like, I don't even know what the hell you're saying here. And if I had that in mind in the beginning, I would be afraid to even drop the line. You know what I mean? Like I wouldn't even be audacious. It would sort of incentivize a sort of aesthetic conservatism in my writing, you know what I mean? Because I'd be afraid of like basically falling flat on my ass. So I think I'm very supportive and like very open and encouraging on my very first invention phase is what I call it, where you're just inventing. And then the more and more I go back to it, I think the harsher I am, because I have to realize that at some point, this isn't my sentence anymore. You know what I mean? Like this isn't my text. I'm the creator, but the instant I form a relationship with the reader, you know what I mean? Like I have a commitment to understand, to consider their point of view. I don't have to give them anything they want. You know what I mean? I don't have to, give them everything they demand. I don't have to, satisfy all their expectations, but I feel like I have to honor that there's an inherent dialectical relationship between, what I write and what they read. And, on some level, I want them to love it, but I also, want to be true to my sort of artistic vision. So the further on I go in the revision, I think the more I try to think from an editorial point of view and less from a creative point of view. You know what I mean? Yeah,
that makes sense. And I like how you're negotiating that. It's like you have to stay true to whatever that like sense of fun or adventure that kicked off the whole thing. Like you want to stay true to it while acknowledging the existence of that person on the other side, but not like, not like giving everything up to them at the same time.
Mhm.
It's such a
Yeah.
tricky thing. And I think it's one that's especially hard for students and people in workshops to sort of
Mhm.
figure out how to do. And
Right.
I guess I mean, you've been a teacher for a long time. And I'm curious about how that has informed this work, the other work that you're doing, how you think maybe about all of these questions from revision to even like, even one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, like publishing and small press
Mhm.
publishing and the
Mhm.
whole kind of 9 yards.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the general rule for me has been when I have to teach it, I have to understand it. You know what I mean? When I'm a student, I just have to learn, and I can hide all the shit I don't know behind a really, brutal question, you know what I mean? And I can just add one mean question in workshop and then sit, the rest of the time being like, yeah. But when you have to teach it, you have to have answers for everything, even questions you don't have answers to, right? And
Yeah.
and when you don't know the answers, you have to make that a teachable moment for you. So I think being forced to understand craft insofar as I had to be forced to, understand the pedagogy of craft has really helped me understand not just why writers do what they do, but selfishly understand why am I doing what I'm doing? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And for whom am I doing it for? And what are the rules for craft? When can they be broken? Who gets to break them? Who decides which rules deserve to be broken? Which ones are sacred and should be protected? Which ones should be interrogated? You know what I mean? And I have way more questions about craft than I used to, but I do feel like that relationship, like having to teach creative writing, has been amazing for me because it makes me realize there's just still so much I don't understand about, the art of fiction. You know what I mean? That like I'm constantly like evolving, and that there's some things that my students like get that took me a lifetime. You know what I mean? And then likewise, there's some things that they don't see at all that I can see so clearly. You know what I mean? Because I may have made the same mistake, and I think yeah, so teaching creative writing, despite its issues and limitations, I feel like it just forces me to keep on evolving. You know what I mean? Not just to keep on reading great literature, but also just to keep understanding and becoming more self-conscious of the reasons we write what we write and the consequences of those choices we make. You know what I mean? And because I see it, in our students, when like if they get like a piece they publish in a literature journal, you're like, wow, you're like so happy that someone else saw their talent that you've seen for like years, right? But then on the other hand, I have so many students who are crazy talented and they're like, this sucks, Jackson, I just want to give up. You know what I mean? And like I see myself in that, and that frustration.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think that's one reason I always try to encourage them to just like, look, if you have to do this, you're going to do it anyways. You know what I mean? Like if you don't have to write, then you'll find something else that is way healthier. And you know what I mean?
I know, right? It's like if you, there are so many things to do. There are so many things people can do.
So many things that can make you happy and satisfy you, where you'll be paid your worth.
Important things.
Yeah. So many things. So if you are feeling anything else, just please do it.
Yeah, I've definitely had that conversation with students before. I think I kind of like tiptoed into this in the last question, and I want to make sure we leave time for audience questions too. So I'll ask this one and then maybe squeak in one more. But okay. I'm curious about what your experience with Noemi Press has been like, and just you submitted this book to a book contest. For any students who are listening or maybe listening to the webinar, I know that there's a lot of not always a ton of information about how one goes about having a small press a publication like this one and a beautifully made book that and so I guess I'm just curious to hear a little bit about what that was like for you and how you kind of found this book a home.
Yeah, so for me, I just entered this manuscript in Noemi Press's 2020 prose contest, and to be honest, I didn't really have a lot of faith. I never have faith, in any sort of writing contest. I feel like, well, this is a donation, you know what I mean, to the press. And like, that's kind of how I look at it. I'm helping this small press stay afloat. And that was exactly how I remember even submitting this and like turning to, LB and being like, well, they got $20, but they deserve it. They're publishing some great stuff. Yeah. And you know what I mean? I want them to stay, I want them to thrive. So, I'm happy to help. And I think I was honestly just shocked when they send me an email saying like, we love this, we want to publish it, you won this prize, because, you know, the truth is like almost no one wins these prizes, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, they're hard to win. And the other thing is that I'd already gotten this manuscript sort of partially accepted by Wayne State University Press, right? They were really interested in it, and it was in the process of being peer reviewed. So then I had to like, you know, decide which press I thought was better for me, you know, stuff like that. So, you know, ultimately, I think my experience was really positive. The editors were smart and really insightful, and I was really impressed just with all the books that Nomi had like published. Their poets were like sort of like rock stars in their own right, you know, and it seemed like they were trying to sort of really like push the envelope in terms of like the sort of formal inventiveness of the prose they were publishing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the person before me, Sarah Miner, her book is like amazing and like really cool and smart. So I think I just, you know, I was impressed with what they did, but I really was happy with how they were giving a voice, giving space for this kind of adventurous writing that frankly doesn't get a lot of appreciation, you know what I mean, in corporate publishing, and a lot of times it's excluded. So yeah, I think all those things, you know, sort of entered in my decision to go with them.
Yeah. I love that, like formulating in a way you're thinking like, whose voices do I want to be among? Like, who do I want to be on the list with me? Like, I want to be with these poets. I can see myself and my work here, which is, I think, a really nice way to think about like where you want your book to end up. Sometimes people just get so like hungry for like any deal, like the book deal, that piece about where your voice like would make the most sense or would be published the most beautifully and thoughtfully, like can get lost a little bit. It looks like I have a couple more questions, but it looks like we have some questions from the audience. I want to make sure we get to this one, and I'll let John take that.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, we have our first question, and attendees can feel free to continue to submit them using the Q&A. But a viewer writes, how did you first get into publishing your own work, I assume, and what did you major in? Did you always know you wanted to be a writer?
Yeah, all great questions, honestly. So let's see. I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I think when I was in 5th grade, I got bullied, as many metrosexual cute boys in America will. You know, one of my first responses was to write a handbook to protect myself. So I wrote this ridiculous book in like 5th grade called CAB, Kids Against Bullies. You know what I mean? It was like, I only got 10 pages into it, you know what I mean? But like, even then, like I saw that I found consolation in writing, you know, like it was such a strange thing to realize, looking back. So I think that emotionally, writing has always been a place where I felt like if I was allowed to write in the way that I wanted to write, that I could create stories that made sense to my worldview, you know what I mean? And I felt that way from a very early on, just sort of sheer immensity and expansiveness of the genre, you know what I mean? And how incredibly accommodating it can be. So my major in college, I was a comp lit major. And basically, unless you want to teach, you know, like Wittgenstein for the rest of your life, you're kind of screwed, you know, for your life choices. So that was my major. And quickly I was like, wow, this is never gonna lead me to any place except, you know, an obscure job teaching philosophy, you know what I mean? In some unknown university in like, you know, Abu Dhabi or something. You know, I just was really worried about just being away from everyone. So, but I wrote all the time, you know, like whoever I was friends with or whoever I was dating, I was always like, oh, look, here's a new story. And I feel bad. And I apologize to all my exes for, you know, forcing you to read those drafts. But it was a, you know, huge part of my life, I think, from a very early age. I just didn't think of myself as a writer until I think I got my first publication, you know, in an actual literary journal, a print one. So I had a piece come out in Fiction out of New York City. And that was when I was like, holy shit, you know what I mean? Like, and I think that's when I realized maybe I'm not the only person who thinks I have talent. And I think that's what I needed, some sort of external validation, not inside my own brain or social structure, you know what I mean? Of someone who just thought I had something to tell. Yeah.
Emma writes, what is the most difficult part about writing and pulling together a non-linear narrative? What is your best advice for writing non-traditional narratives?
Yeah. My advice is write in whatever is the most emancipating form. You know what I mean? And if that's non-linear, then write that way. And if that's linear, then write that way. You know, like I think my issue was I kept trying to write sort of like classic, straight up narrative when I just don't know how to write that way. I'm not really that good. There's a million people who can do it better than I can. So if you feel invested in writing sort of nonlinear narrative, I would say honor those instincts, you know what I mean? And later on, you can figure out why that specific way of telling stories like appealed to you. But, in general, my advice would be, are there reasons why that is a better form for you? Like, is it because it mimics the way memory works? You know what I mean? Is it because it challenges our notion of what a narrative arc is? You don't have to figure that out right away, but I feel like you should listen to yourself. And if you're attracted to nonlinearity, for example, I would say write it in the way that makes sense to you, and then you can always go back, right, and revise it, and then your revision you can have more coherence. But I'm always telling people, like, write whatever way emancipates you, you know what I mean? Because for a lot of people, they're attracted to a specific type of storytelling, and then they're told a different way. And sometimes the way you're told is the way you want to write, but a lot of times it's, it's not. So honor your inner voice creatively, and put it in the way that your brain understands them, not necessarily the way that you think you should tell those stories.
Thank you. Julie, I'm happy to turn it back to you for maybe one or two more questions, or maybe one last question before we
sure.
wrap up for the evening.
I think I am just have one question that I really want to know, which is, I would love, Jackson, if you could talk a little bit about the many books that you have coming out next. You have 2 books coming out next year, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Can you talk about those, and also maybe what else you might be working on?
Yeah, I'm happy to. By the way, I apologize for the weird lighting. It just unfortunately, like, I have to either like open up and then I'm blinded, or I have to have this half like thing, so it looks like
we're jealous in the western edge of the Eastern time zone, where it's now dark at 3:00. So we just don't apologize.
It's been dark all day.
All right. I'm sorry. I won't talk about the sun. So yeah, okay. So thank you for asking that, Julie. It's a really generous question. I have like basically 3 books that are coming out in 9 months of each other, and I would never wish this on like even like my worst enemy. It's like it's just too much work because you can't even like breathe. Like I'm doing the PR for this book, but then I'm revising like the novel one last time. And then I'm trying to find a publicist for like the 3rd book, and it's like. But to answer your question, yeah, I have a novel coming out in March of 2022 by 713 Books. It's a Brooklyn indie, and it's called Amnesia of June Bugs, and it will have some of the same things that this book has. The entire novel is told backwards, basically, and it uses like the theme of insects, the 4 stages of insect metamorphosis, to tell a story about 4 people whose lives intersect in a New York subway during Hurricane Sandy. So that book's going to be coming out soon. And then I have an experimental memoir about mixed race hop-up part Asian identity that's coming out in July by Unsolicited Press. That's a Portland indie. And it's basically an entire memoir that's sort of a choose your own adventure. It's like you read either a short lyric essay, personal essay, or a autobiographical list. And then at the end of every number, you get to basically decide where you want to read. So we'll say, like, if you want to see the first time Jackson fell in love, go to page 53. If you want to see the words that like still hurt him when he hears them inside his head, go to page 76. If you want to see the first time he met his Japanese family in like Osaka, go to page 225. So it's kind of like that, and it gives readers an incredible amount of creative control to decide basically how the memoir is told. Do you want to dive into trauma? Do you want to avoid it? Do you want to just read things that make you feel good? Do you want to read things that are sort of, convoluted and hard to understand? So you, the reader, will sort of direct the memoir in a way. And what I'm hoping is everyone will read a different version of that book, so no one can agree on it. You know what I mean? But it also places responsibility, to go back to your earlier point. It's like, if you say, I didn't like, the narrative speed of that memoir, well, you picked badly. You know what I mean? Readers have a lot of control to decide.
That's like a great way to just never have to take a review seriously.
Totally. It's such a cop out. I was like, well, it's not my fault. You just made bad choices, and go back and read again. Yeah. So those are the 2 books coming out next year.
Julie, I think we have time to slip in one more question if you had one more. Otherwise,
Yeah, I
I'm just-
mean, I guess the only thing you didn't say, Jackson, is so you're working on those things, but are you working on something else? Like, are you working on another book project too?
Yeah. So I haven't had time, but like the next big project I'm working on is I'm trying to create a literary trilogy of 3 different novels, all about the same character, all sort of, again, with this counterfactual narrative technique. So each novel is going to basically be one big choice that he made. The first novel will be he stays with his girlfriend, he goes with her to Argentina. The second novel is they break up, he goes to grad school. The third one is, they break up, he goes to Japan. And it's sort of each book honors the major life choice that mixed race character made. And each book is written in a different modality too. So one is written in postmodern technique. One is going to be written basically in what I'm calling an egalitarian critique. So wherever the character is, he writes in that style. So when he's in Argentina, he writes like Bolaño. When he's in Chicago, he writes like a Carver short story. When he's in California, he writes sort of like, I don't know if California has an aesthetic, but you know what I mean? He writes in sort of a California technique. And then the third book is basically in epistolary format, all written in letters. So yeah, that would be the next 10 years of my life, probably.
Not ambitious at all.
No, not at all.
Well, thanks, Jackson. It was great to get a chance to catch up like this.
Julie, it's funny that this is the last time this is how I'm talking to you again, but it's just great to see you.
I know.
Yeah, Julie and I we wanted to hang out all the time, but then the pandemic hit, in Ann Arbor, so we just could never hang out. So ironically, this is
and Jackson moved.
Yeah, then I moved back to LA. So yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll have you back for all 3 of those novels, if not the books that are coming out next year, when it's safe to do so. But Julie Buntin, Jackson Bliss, thank you so much for joining us at Home with Literati. We hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us as well. We hope to see you at the next event. Take care, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.